Hello again. This is Professor Zafari, and I think it's time to get started. What I want to do in this video is to give you a quick overview of Chapter 1 and to also give you some study suggestions. This is actually a textbook that I like quite a bit. There's many textbooks that I just simply don't think are that great, but this one I like a lot. And the things that I like about it, I want to point out to you in this video, and I also want to give you some study strategies so that you can get the most out of it. The chapter 1 starts with explaining the origins of the first human civilizations. And the introduction here is really interesting because if you'll notice, there's a whole series of questions. And it's these questions that frequently drive human beings and that frequently drive human creative inspiration. So you'll notice here these questions: how and why did life originate? What is our purpose on earth? How do human beings achieve harmony with the natural world and with each other? Well, these questions are essential to what we're studying. One of my favorite definitions of the humanities is to study the multiple creative ways human beings seek to understand and change the world around them. So, for example, when a philosopher is trying to understand the universe and is trying to determine whether truth is something that can be found in the material world, or truth is only an abstract concept that can be found in another realm, or whether an artist is trying to capture the beauty of a waterfall, or a poet is trying to capture the sadness he or she feels at the death of a loved one. These are all different ways we human beings are trying to understand our world and, in a way, trying to have an influence, trying to change the world in some way. So this is my favorite definition of the humanities. So the overview of this chapter is quite good. It raises these key concepts. And sometimes I think the introduction to chapters is overlooked. We think that it's not really significant. Let me get to the main page and let me get to the bold words. But I don't think you should skip these overviews. I think they help. The next thing I really like about this book is that every chapter ends with a timeline. And if you'll skip to your textbook, the timeline for chapter 1 can be found on 27. And I'm very much a visual learner, and for me these can be really great ways to keep the sequence of things in order and to also see how things progress. So I can see just by looking at this page that it's the Mesopotamians who came before the Chinese civilization of the Zhou era. I can see just by looking at the order visually what happened first, what happened second. So it makes sense then that we can see that, for example, Egyptian art and Egyptian developments could have influenced the ancient Phoenicians. These guys came first, these guys came later, and you can see this all very visually. So what you might want to do is flip to the back of a chapter, take a look at this timeline, and use it as a backbone to your studies. And then as you get started with your reading, if you'll flip back to page 2 and follow along with me, I would suggest that you use these headings to organize your notes. It is proven time and time again that when you handwrite notes, you learn concepts better. It's not the same if you type them. It's not the same if you just highlight in your textbook. When you handwrite concepts, you learn them much better. And what I would also suggest is that when you are paying attention to those bold words, such as here you see naturalism, pay attention not just to the simple definition of the word, but pay attention to the ideas that is connected to those words and those concepts. That's really what we're aiming to study in this course, the ideas behind these big cultural developments. Another thing I like about the textbook you can see on chapter 3. And there are these boxes called Making Connections. And what they do is offer an opportunity to connect an idea we're learning about the past to something that's going on in our current world. So for example, you can see in this illustration that this ancient sculpture that is supposed to represent a female figure, a fertility figure. You can see a lot of similarities in this contemporary work that was done in 1967. So there's still connections between these ancient ideas. In chapter 2, your textbook will point out the similarities between ancient Greek columns and architecture to the White House. So I like those sections. Pay attention to those as well. So let's take a look really quickly at page 9 in this chapter. And let's just give a mock-up of how I would suggest going about studying these pages. As I said, record the main ideas as you pay attention to those bold words. You see the bold words here, polytheism and cosmology. So why is the book pointing them out? Why are they in bold? Are they in bold just because they might be an unfamiliar word, or are they in bold because they're significant? So stop and ask yourself those questions. And then the next thing I would suggest is that you should notice that the Epic of Gilgamesh is given much more attention than other concepts that are mentioned very briefly. This should tip you off that it's an important topic. It's a topic you should read perhaps twice. It's a topic that you can probably bet money will be on your exam. And it's a topic that you should make sure that you have a strong comprehension of. On the next page, on page 11, you'll notice that there is an excerpt of Hammurabi's code. And so again, when the textbook is taking some extra space and some of your extra time to pay attention and present to you an excerpt, it's important. Pay attention to it. And notice that at the bottom of this box, there's study questions. Those questions are your key. You're not expected to memorize in this class. I'm never going to ask you a test question such as, was it verse 141 or verse 142 that addressed if a woman hates her husband? What I will ask you, though, is that what limits to human equality are suggested in these laws? From this excerpt, how can we evaluate the rights of women? So those key concepts then are what you want to focus on. Those are the questions that can help you to learn the concepts and to make sure that you've really mastered the topics before the exam. So this brings us back to the end of the chapter, if you'll flip again. And here's that timeline that I love. Now I think you can use the timeline in another way. Look it over again and remind yourself of the sequence of events that you've now learned about. And try to identify what cultural developments happened during what time. So for example, in this timeline, it's giving you really the historical events. But we see here that we have the Egyptian Middle Kingdom. This is a great opportunity for you to quiz yourself. What are the significant cultural developments that happened during this era? And what this can also help you to do is to try to understand what the significance of that historical era had on the cultural developments. And what I mean by this is if we're looking at an era such as here, the ancient Phoenicians, and we want to understand their culture a little bit, it really helps us to understand that they came after the Hittites, they came after the Egyptians, they came after the Chinese, and that they had the benefit of all of these previous cultures. So they borrow ideas from them. This is going to help you understand historical context. This is a key concept for us as we study the humanities. It really doesn't help to understand the significance of a sculpture or the significance of a painting, let's say, of Christ on the crucifix. It doesn't help us to understand its significance if we don't understand the historical context. It can be a picture, a painting of Christ on the crucifix, but it can have a completely different meaning if it came from a time and a culture that was very devoutly Christian, and it could have a completely different meaning if it came from a much more irreverent 20th century culture that perhaps is mocking the idea of religion. So historical context is going to be something we really want to consider as we study cultural developments. So, as I said, this is a really great textbook. I think it can be a great tool for your learning. And what I also really respect about the textbook is that it's included excerpts and mention of cultures that are not just American and European. I really appreciate that it's showing us what's happening in ancient China at the same time that it's showing us what's happening in the Mediterranean. I think it's really great for us to have a grasp of what's happening globally, not just in one segment of the world. So I hope this helps. Use these ideas as you go through the other chapters. And what you'll also see in the learning units for each chapter is that I'm going to add some extra information to really bring out and develop our understanding of the key concepts. But this is a really great system that should help you get the most out of these chapters. Good luck.